Hello, good morning, and welcome to this Logistics Manager webinar sponsored by SSI Schaefer. I'm James McLaughlin, Editor of Logistics Manager, and your host for today's session, which is titled Small Systems for Big Impact: How Entry-Level Automation Can Improve Your Operations. Warehouse automation is constantly evolving, and the opportunities to invest in improving supply chain processes are vast. But automation investment is on a scale, and finding what level of automation offers the maximum benefit to a business and its specific requirements is an essential in automating operations. To delve into this topic in more detail, I'm joined today by Jonathan Buckby, UK Head of Sales for Automation at SSI Schaefer. Over the course of this webinar, we'll explore the impact that automation of all sizes can have on improving logistics processes. You'll learn how processes can be improved with automation and how to develop a long-term strategy that integrates automation rather than automation being seen as the end goal. At this point, I'd just like to encourage viewers to ask questions throughout the presentation via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please remember to submit your name, job title, and company name when doing so. I'll pose as many of these questions as possible to Jonathan in the time available following the presentation. Also, a recording of this webinar will soon be made available to view on demand via logisticsmanager.com, so look out for that. And with that, I'll now hand over to Jonathan to start the presentation section of this webinar.
Thank you, James. So yeah, as James just explained there, my name's Jonathan Buckby. I'm Head of Sales at SSI Schaefer. I've been with this organisation within the industry for the past 11 years now, and dealing with everything from fully static solutions all the way to large automation. So the focus area for today is to look at some of the smaller solutions within the automation sector that are made far more accessible and have been a real growth area within the industry, I'd say, over the past 5 years or so. So we'll start to delve into some of these topics now. And some of you that have attended previous webinars will be familiar with this slide. So we say the first step is obviously to look at why we're automating our solutions. Now, of course, that's going to be different for everyone, and it's usually a mix of some of the reasons. But what we typically will find is we're looking at a multitude of things, such as staff, finding the right people, and also at the right cost with cost of living increases, wage spikes. It can be tricky. We've also got productivity challenges. We want organizations to grow. We want to see everyone doing well, succeeding, and to fulfill those orders means we need to have a system that can fulfill them quicker and at a higher rate throughout the day. The other side is to think of us as consumers, and our needs change all the time. Next day delivery is the easy example where we now expect that. If we go back a decade or so, it would always have been a nice to have or something that we pay extra for, whereas today it's absolutely seen as a necessity far more. And we need to be able to evolve with these changes. So quite often automation is then seen as the route to do that. But similarly, there are also practical considerations that we need to factor in when we're looking at automation. If it was that easy, everyone would be doing it, of course, and some of them that come into it. So we have to look at the cost element. There's a pocket of money that will be made available for these projects. Usually, we need to make sure that's available. It's not always easy enough just to go, yes, here's a great payback. If the money's not there to start with, then we need to make sure that that's factored into any solution design that we do. There's also time. So when we're talking about these solutions, there's an implementation period. There's also usually a little bit of a teething period and a ramp-up phase. So we need to take that into consideration by not just saying that from day one, everything will be running like clappers and going at full speed. Similarly, if we design for today's organization and your business needs of today, by the time it's installed and ready to go, that will have changed and moved on and evolved as everything does with great speed. So it's making sure that we have an appropriate time frame to implement any solution and get it running fully. And similarly, how we integrate, if you've got an existing site and you're looking to integrate a system to that, it's not always the easiest thing to do to make sure everything just plugs and plays. So how we integrate the solution is really important, and a practical consideration that can often either shape what a solution looks like, the success of it, and whether even to progress with an automation project. So with those things factored in, I think we're going to move to our first poll question as well for today. So that will pop up on your screen shortly, and we'll give everyone a few seconds to have a look and answer that before we move on to the next section. Okay, hopefully that's been up and come up on the screen. We should be able to get the results shortly. Okay, we'll trust that's come through. It's not popped up on my screen because I can see the slides, but we'll move on to the next part of the webinar today, which is to then understand, when we take those considerations in, what do we see as a small system, and how are we defining that for the purposes of what we're going to talk about today. So I've put 3 criteria here that will really help define what a small system is for us. So the first is investment. Typically, obviously, as a smaller system, there's a lower investment cost, which removes one of those barriers to implementing such a solution. And I think typically we'll talk for the solutions we're going today of under 5 million. Now, even within that, there's quite a wide span of different cost elements and different solution impacts. So there will be quite a span of different implementation costs depending on the different solutions we'll talk about a bit later. Similarly, with implementation, large automation systems can take 2 years plus to develop and install. Now, that's usually just down to the sheer quantity of kit that's there. But for the solutions we'll talk about today, we'll be talking anywhere from 3 to 18 months, again, depending on the complexity and size of what's being spoken about. But also experience, I think it comes into it. A lot of SMEs, when they're taking this step and going to the solutions that we'll talk about, it usually is their first step into anything automated. And the solutions that we'll go through and this development that's come through the industry of really focusing on this sector has given them a lot more confidence and a lot more flexibility into what they can look into. So there'll be some of the criteria. But one of the other key points to say is when you do start going through this process is try not to get carried away. You know, there are so many options and so many opportunities and available solutions out there. It is easy to think about what it could be, and then the ideas get floated away. I think we all do that naturally. So when we're talking about smaller solutions and those quick, easy wins, I've highlighted a few different technologies we'll talk about there, and we're going to talk about today. Of course, if the business needs dictate it, then we could talk about larger automation solutions. But I think if we know that we have certain practical limitations, then that automatically creates a nice ceiling where we know that we can focus underneath. So one term that gets mentioned quite a lot is semi-automation, and I think everyone, similar to automation, in fact, has a different definition of what that could mean or what that does mean. From our perspective, again, I've just put some criteria there that would help define how we see semi-automation. So the first is that it still requires some level of personal interaction. Now, what that means differs. So it could mean that it needs a person to control that the system is going to move in itself and create an action. It could mean that it needs someone to go over and physically remove stock and physically induct stock into the system. Lots of different ways it could be, but the semi part of that is that not everything is going to be automated. There is still going to be a person involved. However, there are still large efficiency gains by doing so, whether that's through automated product movement, whether it's through density of storage, or whatever else that the business is looking to achieve. Linked to that's control. So what we mean by that is software. Many semi-automated systems can be done with a level of software control, but then also offer the option of push button and more manual operations. Whereas something fully automated, from our definition, would all be software controlled. So having something semi-automated does remove a layer of complexity and often a layer of cost by not having to have the automated option, although that is still there. And usually these types of systems will perform a single operation at a time. So rather than having lots of concurrent flows going through any system, typically something that's semi-automated will be focusing on one process and one requirement at any given time. So for us, that's how we would define a semi-automated system. And we've got the three examples there on the right-hand side of a simplistic conveyor, a mobile racking solution that has a single aisle open at a time and moves pallets to give storage density. And then at the bottom, the vertical lift, which will be for small unit storage, utilizing the height of the building by having tray access one at a time. So when we're designing these solutions, obviously they have their core benefits that I've just touched a few upon, but the other thing to focus on is there are also softer benefits when we do look at semi-automation. So I've just come up with looking at the Logimat here, which is again is our vertical lift solution. We would define that as semi-automated, the reason being that I can go up to the screen, use a push button method to say, bring me this particular tray. Then I need a person to interact to pick from it and replenish stock. But I do get the benefit of, like as we said a minute ago, storing all that density and use the building height. I don't need to do as much walking. There is the option to link it to software if wanted, but there are also many other benefits that can often be ignored and maybe less tangible, but are important to consider. So a few of them we've got here. We've got security. What we mean by that is the stock's all contained within a box. So going in and accessing that isn't always easy to do. If I'm an operator and I really wanted to get in there and get something, then it would be incredibly difficult for me to do, especially if it's on a high shelf. So if we're talking high value products or items that are easily resellable or high value to steal, for example, in certain medications, getting them out of the way is a huge benefit in terms of security. Linked to that, we also have tracking. So with these systems, you could have a login at an individual basis that would then give different people at different levels access to trays. What that means then is if anything did go missing, or if you wanted to find out who had performed a particular operation, you can track that back to who logged in at the time. Ergonomics, whilst it's closer to a core benefit, it's also something that doesn't always get seen perhaps as strong as it could. So the tray can be delivered at different heights. There are tilt options. There are pointer options. So if I was an operator stood in front of such a machine, it makes my life a lot easier than having to walk around and pick from shelving, bending and pulling from different heights. So having something like this gives a far greater benefit there. The last two as well, again, often overlooked, but working environment and recruiting options. So quite often we've seen with some of our clients when they invest in semi-automation or full automation, are then able to push that forwards and say, look, we're a forward-thinking company. This is what we're looking to do. We have this roadmap and these are the investments that we're willing to make in our operation. And quite often that leads them to then be able to recruit easier within the area, but also from a worker's perspective, walking into somewhere like that, it is a bit nicer and often a bit cooler and a bit something a bit more high tech that they can go home and tell people about, spread the word and feel more valued when they're in the workplace. So all of those reasons may not be the core benefit that you're looking for, but they're also important to factor in and can add value to the business in different ways. An example we'll give here, whilst this is a fully automated system, is for Harrods. So they have mini load cranes to store some of their products. One of the benefits that they have discussed with us is, again, that security challenge. As we all know, Harrods is a high value product and a high value retailer. So there is some level of attraction to a lot of the products. But the view is if operators want to go in and climb through a rack to try and get something, well, good luck to them, because it's a very high risk thing to try and do. So they get a greater level of security through that. And then even at the pick stations that you can see in front, operators need to log in to be able to use them. So again, there's full traceability on who's been using what. The next area we want to talk about is zone picking. Now, while this isn't a technology, it's a concept. It's one that is really important and a really good starting place because it's very easy to implement. Now, when we're talking about automated systems, we can have a conveyor that feeds between the zones, because the idea of zone picking is quite simple. It's just I separate my warehouse into zones, and I have an operator that can work on one or more of those zones at a time before handing over orders, whether those orders are batched, separated, or however that's best done. The reason that it's far more efficient is because people get used to working in their zone. We'll come on to a few more of the benefits later, but there are ways that we can increase that. So we need to pass orders from zone to zone. And one way that you can do that is with that small diagram we've put there of having a conveyor loop that runs through the center. Operators then don't have to walk at all, and they can feed their orders between each other easily and comfortably. Usually with a system like that, there's the opportunity to reuse some equipment. So if I've already got shelving or flow racking or however it's stored, I can implement it quickly and easily. Or you can even run a trial version by just having a handover point using the existing equipment, see if it works before you decide, yes, this is something that's working for us. So now I want to invest to see how far we can push those benefits. And here we have a summary of some of the things that you would gain from with a zone pick system. So picking productivity, I don't have to walk, which is really important. Walking time is wasted time when I'm in a warehouse. So the more of that we can get away with, the better. Also, users become familiar with their zones. So they'll know if I'm storing the same stock in the same locations regularly, exactly where everything is, and can do that walk far more effectively over time. Similarly, if they are, in a non-walking environment or the locations are dynamic, they start to understand where the fastest movers should be placed, how to best work through their picking work for a particular order or batch, depending on how that's done. Similarly, accuracy. If I have fewer SKUs to pick from as an individual, it makes my life a lot easier and far less confusing. So I can then pick far more accurately and understanding where everything is. Also, I will have a set number of orders that I'm picking to at any given time. Again, single order or batch, depending on the operation as to what would work best. But I'm going to be far more accurate doing that than just picking whatever comes from the entire stock range. And also flexibility. So we design the stations to suit however big they are, small they are. It could be one station, it could be an entire zone made up of lots of different shelving bays, for example. But what I can also do is flex up and down. So if I'm during a peak period, I might have one operator per zone. Maybe during quieter times, that operator can service multiple zones because we don't need the same level of productivity and same level of throughput. Now, one thing to point out is this is, as we said, a concept rather than necessarily a technology, but we can improve all of the above using technology without having to go to full automation or huge capital investments. So if we take, for example, a pick by light system, maybe that would go on to a zone pick, well, that means I don't have to think about where product is. I can just go pick it to improve my productivity. I know exactly what I'm picking and where I'm getting it from and how much I need to pick, because that'll tell me on the light display. So it improves my accuracy too. So there's lots of other technologies that come into that. Conveyor is another good example of not having to walk. But we can, without having to go to the great levels and great extents, make quite a good impact with the zone pick with minimal investment. And one customer of ours that did just that is Draper Tools. So this is an installation in the UK that's been alive for a couple of years now. And what these guys are doing, as the name suggests, they sell tools and various bits and pieces that go into DIY. But what you can see there behind Matt as he's talking is flow racking, and we'll see in a moment how things move throughout the system. But there is a lot of manual kit here that is then serviced and assisted by automation to gain the benefits of easy and quick installation, not breaking the bank in terms of cost, but still giving them what they need. So automatic destacking of totes here launches their orders and gets them off and running, so they don't need someone to go and retrieve totes to get their order. You've just seen there in the conveyor system that they are then routed to the necessary pick stations, which are made up of flow racking in the front, and then I've got some long span shelving behind for slower moving items or for larger items. So what that means is I've got quicker access to the quicker moving stock directly in front, and I do a walk for the items that I don't need. So it helps blend storage density per station with picking productivity. You might also have seen on the front of those stations, there is a pick by light guidance system. So that again gives an operator to show exactly what they need to get, where they need to get it from, and the quantity they need to achieve. Great example too of the flexibility. I've got a couple of operators here working across all stations because they don't need the productivity at that given time. Orders then flow station to station to station until they're complete before they go off to a pack bench and are sent out. So the list on the left-hand side there, in terms of products that moves automatically, we have the conveyor and we have the auto order launch. The rest of it is manual equipment, again, some of which was already existing. So there was a huge cost saved by doing that. But it's for us, a semi-automated system that gives exactly what they need in terms of pick productivity and order throughput without having to go to great levels of complexity or cost. And I think that's also time for the next poll question. So I'll hand back over and wait for that to pop up. And again, give everyone some time just to answer the poll question as it arrives. Just while you're doing that, you can see the orders going through the Draper system, arriving at pack benches, and then conveyed, ready to be loaded directly onto booms in this instance, straight into the back of the van. So in terms of transportation time and walking, it's not completely eradicated, but it is far reduced by having that conveyor system in there. Okay, hopefully that's given you enough time to answer your poll question as well. So I'll move on to the next section, which is starting then to look at ASRS technology. Now, I think, again, a few years ago, ASRS technology was the reserve of the huge automation systems that we'd look at, whereas now, the industry has developed so many different routes to an ASRS that are scaled down and give customers exactly what they need without any excess. It means it's so much more accessible for everyone to get to. So this is our offering that you can see here, which is the Rackbot, where I have tower bots, which are the tall ones you can see in the picture on the right hand side and just being illustrated there in the video, doing the storage operations by transporting multiple totes or cartons at a time into a rack. And then also what you can see just now coming into the video at the bottom there was a run bot. So on the bottom location, there is a pickup and drop off point where a run bot will pick a tote up, and that will either be transported either into the rack or away to be put back away, or out of the rack to be taken to an operator station, whether that's picking, decant, straight out the door to a dispatch lane, whatever that's going to be. So the system that you see here is closed loop, and you can see that with the fencing that's there. So operators do not go into that area. They simply wait until something has been dropped off. But a solution like this allows us to install the number of racks that are needed, the number of robots that are needed, and can flex that up and down depending on the portfolio. What it also means is that if in future there is a need to add storage or add throughput, the two are not directly linked. So you could add robots or add racks or a combination, depending on how those needs changed. And as you can see, it's just popping up. It's not industry specific. It will work across a number of sectors. There's also different ranges of ASRS that we have available for us, but the overall underlying point is that such a system becomes far more cost effective, far more user friendly. You can see this is a combination with high robotics, far more user friendly and accessible to a wider range of the market. And as I've just kind of touched upon there, the reasons that this makes this technology far more mass market now than perhaps it was is that reduced firepower. Not everyone needs to do thousands, tens of thousands of movements every hour. And if that's the case, then why would you buy a system that has that firepower? Because there's going to be excess spend. Now we can have a technology like this that delivers exactly what's required for the needs at the time, can grow. So that's the scalability point as the customer grows and develops their journey, but doesn't over-egg the pudding from day one. And similar to the scalability point, you've also then got flexibility. The good thing is no one quite knows what the future is going to hold, though we've got some kind of idea, hopefully, within the short term at least. If that does change or go slightly sideways, or we know we have, touch wood, it never happens, but we have another pandemic or something like that, and the whole market changes completely, the system can adapt depending on what you need moving forward. There's also the level of simplicity. It's a fairly standard rack that goes onto the floor. It's a fairly standard robot that's not quite plug and play, but as close as can possibly be. So in terms of implementing that quickly, easily, and with limited specialist equipment, it becomes a far easier prospect because the Rackbots, the racks, the robots, they are all standardized, adjusted and customized, of course, to the client needs, but it's not like everything is specifically built to order. So the competition and the range of options within this mid-market ASRS, I guess we can call it, has increased dramatically to mean that everyone has to keep working, keep innovating to develop that edge, which drives technology up, prices down, and I think has created a really good environment for SMEs to look at entry-level automation now. And I really want to oversimplify processes a little bit just to show the areas that this can help with. So if we really look at a simplistic model of what we do within the warehouse and then look at the areas that the ASRS can help with that, then what we have here is all processes in yellow, and then the green ones are the items that would be assisted fully through an ASRS. The one in the middle that's yellow pick, you may think, well, surely that's automated. It could be. We're assuming that the physical pick process from the tote is still done manually for this purpose. However, if you look at the green ones, which are put away, traveling to location, repeat, and obviously the traveling back, that's what's the wasted time. Walking time is wasted time. But they're also the most common operations in the warehouse, because I can put away a full carton or a full tote of stock and then probably want to pick individual units. So those movements are the most common operations, so they can have the biggest impact. And usually, I'm not going to say always because our business is different, but usually form the biggest element of any kind of ROI calculation when we come to look at those parts of it. That's not to say, other elements couldn't be automated. You could automate the pick process. You could automate the receiving stock or packing processes with auto baggers or something similar. There's lots of other ways that we could build upon that. This is just the core ASRS system itself. But here we see a really good reason why this technology is taking off at the rate it is because it can have the biggest impact on the largest pain points with now shorter implementation, lower costs, and So it's a real win-win for everyone. And again, I've just popped a video in here, which gives a case study for one system that we've implemented in Spain with Desigual, or a fashion house. So what they're doing is they've implemented a Rackbot Eco, which just uses the tower bots. The reason being that's the throughput that they need, and you can deliver that without having to, again, buy the run bots effectively. So they get what they need for what they want to spend and not have to invest more than they need. But what you can see on the video is just showing here the rack port, which then implements 8 cartons simultaneously to be transported and stored. So you don't have to go backwards and forwards all the time, and maximizes the efficiency of every movement. But the key things to point out at the left-hand side, so they needed to store best part of 8,000 cartons and retrieve and deliver 650 of those per hour. If we were talking in fully automated solution terms, you'd be looking at 2 hours of shuttle to do that, which would be very short to get those storage locations in, which probably wouldn't make sense. Or if we were talking mini load, you'd need 6 to 7 aisles, which again, huge excess cost compared to something like this, because the storage element is quite low relative to the throughput. So that meant that they have this middle element now they can look at and find the right technology for what they need, whilst meeting the service level requirements of their consumers. So it's, again, a really simplistic system that wouldn't have been available, let's say, again, a decade ago. But these smaller systems really packing a punch for the customers that are using it. And I think this is also time for the final poll question of the day. So whilst the video is playing, I'll just let that pop up and give you some time to answer. There we go. Nice cue to move on. So yeah, another good example of how these systems can provide real benefits and real impacts. But there are other ways that we can make sure that any system we implement can increase and grow in terms of benefit by looking at things outside of the technology. So again, I've just highlighted 3 points here that we can use to do that. So our processes, can we make sure that they are maximized and as efficient as possible for the mech itself? What we're doing now, can we look at changing that? Do we need to change it, or can we make the mech bend to what we need to do? So we've already spoken about zone picking and order methods, for example, and going through those. Do we need to have a sortation process, a sequencing process, these kind of things that come into it? But if we can think about our processes interacting with the mech, it's the way to make things work best. Because the flip side of that too is true. There's no point implementing some new piece of technology just for the sake of it. If it doesn't work with the processes that we're doing currently, then it's clearly the wrong thing for the organization and the business. So making the processes and the mech match up with each other really helps create a system that is bigger than the sum of its parts. Linked to that in some ways is smart storage. So do we have everything in the right places? For example, are my fast movers in the easiest location to get to, if they're going to be within the system? If I'm going to pick items commonly together, are they on the same Logimat tray? Are they in cartons that are close to each other for me to get to? Can I make sure that all that is thought about correctly? Do we have to treat certain SKUs differently? For example, oversized, or if something moves abnormally quickly or slowly, do I deal with that slightly differently? So again, it's not necessarily linked to the mech itself and how that works, but making sure that we have things stored in the right way can then give us an efficiency benefit above and beyond what the standard mech's going to do. And then can we reuse as well? So lots of systems will reuse equipment and repurpose equipment in some ways to make sure that we can keep costs down. We've already seen some flow racking that was reused and long span racking that was reused in certain solutions. We've had other large automated solutions where there's an existing mezzanine multi-tier, for example. The purpose of what that's used for changes, but it then integrates to the whole solution. But it's a big cost save element too, and how we can use that. And I've given a couple of examples there. If we've got really fast movers and I've got some existing pallet racking, for example, and I'm implementing something semi-automated, well, I'll keep the fast movers on the in the manual rack because they move so quickly. There's no point putting them into this ASRS to then bring them out. Similarly, with ugly items that don't fit well into another system, I've got to store them somewhere else. Then I've linked back to the processes. How do we consolidate all those things? So it's important to think beyond the walls of the technology itself and use different thought processes to make sure that we're getting the most out of our system, regardless of size, spend, implementation time, all those things. We want to get the most out of what we're buying. And then finally, just to sum up before we go on to any questions that you guys might have, I've tried to summarize some of the discussion points that we've covered today, which is firstly understanding the options. There's far more available now than there ever has been, which for any SME is a fantastic thing. You've got more choice, which means you're more likely to hit something closer to exactly your needs than something that fits as best can. So it's really important to try and understand those options as best we can, whether that's engaging with consultancy or if you speak to someone like Schaefer, who are a multi-offering solution provider. So what that means is we've got various technologies and we're not pigeonholed to one. That can often help just break through some of the noise that can sometimes be a bit confusing. So understanding the options is really important. Also understanding the processes linked to anything. So it's not just how many cartons can the system deliver and how many can it store. It's okay, then how are we going to pick from it? How are we going to replenish the system? How are we going to sort through our orders? All those questions that come into it really help maximize the potential impacts of any system implementation. And they're also really important because it can be very easy to implement something because we think it's the right thing to do. If we haven't thought about the end-to-end process, it can actually be a hindrance rather than help. So making sure that everything works end-to-end and how that technology fits in with the processes is really important. And that leads nicely to the last point, which is be results focused. So the automation isn't the result. The result is delivering orders or delivering the outputs that the organization needs. The automation and the tech needs to be a tool to help deliver that. And again, the whole purpose obviously of today is to look at how these smaller systems can provide bigger impacts. So understanding that maybe I don't have to go to the ends of the world to do that, can I look at smaller ways to improve that to get the same result? As we say, the options are now far wider for everyone. With everything though, and when we're going through this process and this journey, the first step's often the most difficult one. So I hope there's been some information that we can take away from today to help you when you go on your journey to look at your operations. And I will hand it back over now to the team at Logistics Manager to see if you've got any questions we'd like to go through. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that excellent presentation. So we'll shortly be doing the interactive Q&A section of the webinar. So for our viewers, if you haven't already, now's the time to submit your questions. Before we get into that, I would just like to share with everyone the results of the polls we've run throughout this session. So the first question was, what do you see as the main obstacle to automating your processes? And we found here that cost, 56% of people said it was cost, 20% said complexity, 20% said integration, and 4% said time. So we can see that cost is the biggest challenge people are facing, with over half of respondents citing it as the main barrier to automation. The second question was, what makes up the majority of your current intralogistics setup? So for this, 81% said manual processes, 19% said semi-automated, and 12% said fully automated. So we can see here that the vast majority still rely on manual processes, with only a small fraction actually using full-scale automation. And finally, when are you planning to automate was the question we asked. 46%, so nearly half, said between the next 1 and 3 years. 29% said within the next after 3 years, and then 25% said within the next 12 months. So again, nearly half of respondents are targeting automation within the 1 to 3 year time span, while a quarter are moving faster in less than a year. So some interesting results there from the questions. Um, Fantastic. So we'll get into the Q&A now. To kick things off, Jonathan, you mentioned zone picking in there. Can zone picking be implemented without any equipment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the key thing with zone picking is just to have a handover point, really. So if we're separating the areas, I want the ability for all orders to go to all zones because they may need to. So I need to have some kind of handover point. That could be as simple as just a marking on the floor if you're using, for example, trolleys and picking into cartons, just to transfer from one operator to the next. So it's a very easy thing to run a trial with, see if it works, check the benefits before you then dip your toe and start to spend some real money on it. So yeah, absolutely, it's something that can be implemented quite quickly and quite easily, just with a handover point.
What factors would make someone have to consider larger automation systems than those you could have covered in the presentations today?
Yeah, good question. So there's always a point where storage gets too high, throughput gets too high, and then we have to start looking at larger scale systems. They're kind of the obvious ones, but there are some other ones too where if I've got very complicated order profiles, so if I've got lots of units per order and lots of lines per order, and they are mixed SKUs and varying through, I then would have to think of a sortation process, for example, and then larger scale systems start to make sense. So high throughput, high complexity, high storage numbers, but for SMEs and I think for the majority of the marketplace, the kind of things we're talking about today are where the future lies.
So kind of the reverse of that. Are there any benefits for operators that make smaller operations better than the larger systems?
Sure. So one thing is there's the obvious thing of the cost. So smaller systems are cheaper, quicker to implement, but also sometimes agility and flexibility. So if I've got a smaller system and there are more things within my business that maybe fall outside those parameters, it's then easier to adapt. Whereas if I've got a larger system and then something flexes and changes quite dramatically, it can be more difficult to adapt that too. So there is certainly agility and flexibility benefits with something smaller rather than going for a huge system.
Of course, that makes sense, and agility being something that's really important within logistics at the moment. So that makes complete sense. We have another question here. This one comes from Mark Asquith from Betty's and Taylor's group. Can some of the trays be temperature controlled for fresh produce?
Yeah, sure. I'll assume that goes back to the vertical lifting we were talking about. So, in terms of individual trays within the system, unfortunately not, but the Logimat itself can be. So, if you had a proportion of stock that would needed to be temperature controlled, you could do that on a per unit basis. It may be the part of your stock doesn't need to be, and you can have just some of them temperature controlled and some not. So at a tray level, unfortunately not, but at machine level, absolutely.
Our next question comes from Simon Butteris, who's asking, in the case studies you mentioned, did SSI provide complete solutions as a turnkey project? Was there integration of other hardware and software as part of the scope of your work?
Yeah, sure. Good question on that one. So Draper Tools, no, that was all us. Whilst there were some third-party providers. So, for example, the mezzanine, I believe, was from a third party. It was just us that interacted with the customer themselves. With Desigual, it's a Spanish installation. Unfortunately, I look after the UK, so I'm not completely familiar. But if I look at the equipment there, then we would have done all of the integration again. So we would have been a single turnkey provider for the client. But the only thing in there that we've seen that wouldn't be within our scope would have been the spiral conveyor. So from a client perspective, they are just dealing with Schaefer. there's one or two smaller elements that will be third-party provided.
Great. And we have another question here, which is what are the parameters that need to be taken care of while designing the overall warehouse when we are shifting current manual system to semi-automated or an automated setup?
Okay, so the key ones are the core elements of what are we looking to achieve. What's the storage number? What's the throughput number? One thing that comes into it is the growth plan too, because what we don't want to do is design for today. The risk of doing that is by the time you have designed, signed an order, had that installed, implemented, things have already moved on and changed. So if we can understand what the growth parameters are there, then we can build that too. Usually with such questions though, it's really important that as a service provider, we just work with the client and sing off the same hymn sheet, because if then is something is a little bit different, we can understand exactly why that's happened, agree on what's happened, and adapt. I think also, hopefully I'm interpreting this question correctly, but some of it may come into how do we keep operations ongoing at the same time as we're trying to implement a new system, which is a really good point because it's something that can be overlooked. There are lots of things we can do, which is segregation of areas to make sure that we're not impeding on current operations, depending on the space that's available. It again just comes down to working with the client a lot though to understand what needs to go on, what areas do we have, and how can we build in pathways, how can we separate off the warehouse. Health and safety comes into that too, and risk management. So it's always a good question to think about that handover point, certainly in a brownfield installation, but there are ways you can mitigate. It's very difficult to completely get rid of, but certainly mitigate any disruption.
Fantastic. And we've just got time for one last question. How do you track cartons or products? Do you use printed label or RFID? And is print and apply used as part of your automation process?
Good question. The answer is both could be used. So I can use either RFID or printed labels. The majority is printed, labeled, and scanned. The reason being, if I'm doing it at RFID, there's then comes the questions of do I have to RFID the carton itself or do I RFD each individual item that's within there? If I'm doing it at item level, there are then additional complexities on tracking that through the system. It's not impossible though. So we use either or, but labels are certainly the most popular. And we'll typically print and apply a LPN, a license plate number, so that we can track each individual carton through the system.
Brilliant. Well, that brings us to the end of this webinar. I'd like to thank Jonathan Buckby, UK Head of Sales for Automation at SSI Schaefer, for joining us this afternoon. I'd also like to thank SSI Schaefer for sponsoring today's webinar, which will be available to view on demand soon via logisticsmanager.com, in case you'd like to refer back to the presentation or share it with a colleague. So that's it. We've reached the end of this webinar. Thank you all for attending today's session. I hope to see you all again for the next Logistics Manager webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you.